Hello, I'm Deb Bussinger with the Leesburg Public Library. We are so excited to host David Powell today. This program is a partnership between Florida Humanities and the Leesburg Public Library. Funding for this program was provided by Florida Humanities and sponsored in part by the State of Florida Department of State, Division of Arts and Culture, and the Florida Council on Arts and Culture. And I'd like to introduce David. David Powell is a graduate of the University of Texas at Austin and the Columbia Journalism School. David Powell worked as a reporter for the Associated Press in New York, Miami, and Tallahassee. After earning a law degree from Florida State University, he practiced law for 30 years. Moved by the stories of Cuban Americans he met through his work, he began interviewing them for his oral history book about Cuban exiles who came to the US from 1959 to 1973. David and his wife reside in Tallahassee. David, thank you for speaking today, and you may take it from here.
Thanks for that introduction, Deb. I'm delighted to be with you in Leesburg this afternoon via Zoom. And I want to thank Florida Humanities for their role in sponsoring this presentation. As the nonprofit statewide partner of the National Endowment for the Humanities, Florida Humanities funds and coordinates public humanities programs and publications that explore the people, the places, and the ideas that shape life here in Florida. Since its inception, Florida Humanities has awarded more than $20 million in funding to help create and coordinate current and engaging humanities programming. Programs like these help preserve our state's diverse heritage and history, promote civic engagement and community dialogue, and provide communities with an opportunity to reflect on Florida's future. So thanks to all of you for being here. My talk today is about the early Cuban exiles who came to this country in the first 15 years after Fidel Castro took power. It's the beginning of a story that is continuing in our time. I'll save time at the conclusion for your questions. The early exiles were 600,000 Cubans who came to the United States from 1959 to 1973. They came in two massive waves that started a diaspora that is still taking place. Most of the early Cuban exiles arrived on airliners, at first commercial and later charters. They laid the groundwork for the modern Cuban American community. Now, I'm often asked why I got interested in the story of the Cubans. And my answer is, it's a great story. It's a story about ordinary people caught in a struggle between powerful historical forces over which they have no control. But it's more than that. It's a story about America at its best, not perfect, but as the land of refuge and opportunity that it's always been for oppressed people from around the world. And it's a story that shows how refugees will strengthen our country if we let them. What you're going to see here is based on my oral history book about Cuban exiles. Sometimes we forget that history is lived by ordinary people, people like you and me, people like our neighbors, people like our co-workers. To understand the exiles and their story, I interviewed 54 persons who either participated in or witnessed the beginning of the Cuban diaspora. Their stories are often wrenching. For many, it was the most traumatic experience of their lives. Most of my book is taken directly from those interviews. So is most of what you'll hear during my talk today. Almost 2.5 million people in our country were either born in Cuba or described themselves as descendants of those who were. They are clustered in major metropolitan areas in 15 states and the District of Columbia. 2/3 of them live in Florida. Their influence on our state has been profound, economically, culturally, and politically. I don't think you can understand Florida if you don't understand the early Cuban exiles. Cuba and the US have a long and complicated history. During 3 wars of liberation in the 19th century, Cubans went into exile in Key West, Tampa, and New York. Just as Cuban freedom fighters were on the verge of defeating the Spanish Army in 1898 in the Cuban War of Independence, the US invaded and took control of the island. Our army occupied Cuba until 1902. During the occupation, the US installed major public works like roads, bridges, water systems, and American corporations bought land, businesses, and other assets there. Then Cuba had a tumultuous 50 years as a republic, with a government that was often corrupt and frequent political upheavals. In 1952, Cuban democracy ended in a military coup organized by Fulgencio Batista. Havana was one of the world's most glamorous cities. 1 out of every 6 Cubans lived in Havana, and Americans made it one of their favorite playgrounds because it was just a short plane ride from Miami. Dozens of flights went between the United States and Havana every day. You could fly from Miami to Havana for as little as $36 for a round trip. Airlines also took Americans to Cuba from New York, New Orleans, and Houston. Ships sailed to Havana from New York, Miami, and other ports. Many of my narrators have fond memories of Cuba before the revolution. Carmen Royce was trained as a lawyer, married, and then had a son before the revolution. She met Ernest Hemingway at his favorite bar in Havana, the Floridita, which is still there. She remembers the nightlife in Havana, the opulent hotels, the gambling casinos, and lavish shows. She saw Nat King Cole at the Tropicana and Tony Bennett at the Capri. Some of the hotels and casinos were owned and controlled by American gangsters who shared profits with Batista. In 1959, a guerrilla army led by a young lawyer named Fidel Castro drove Batista from the country. This marked the end of an armed insurrection that had been going on for years. Hundreds of the dictator's supporters fled to Miami on airplanes and boats. Castro then led a procession from eastern Cuba to the capital, more than 500 miles. He stopped at cities along the way to cement his role as leader of the new order. He ousted local officials who had supported Batista and named new officials to replace them. He was greeted throughout the country as Cuba's liberator. Castro promised to fulfill the goals that had animated the freedom fighters in the Cuban War of Independence, an end to foreign domination and promoting the general welfare. Many Cubans believed those goals had been frustrated by the American occupation. We Americans tend to underestimate the importance of Castro identifying his revolution as the culmination of the Cuban War of Independence. Emilio Cueto remembers Castro's entry to Havana. Emilio had just graduated from the same prestigious Jesuit school in Havana that Castro had graduated from in 1945. Emilio describes Castro's procession as being just like one of the ticker tape parades for the astronauts that he saw in New York when he later lived there. Here's what Emilio says now. I was a Fidelista. We thought we had a Catholic man, young, socially minded, who promised so much change. He promised the whole program, political and economic, of a liberal democracy. Everybody was so hopeful. Castro was a popular figure in the United States. We forget now that he was regarded as a hero for ousting the dictator. The New York Times, the New Yorker magazine, and others called him a Robin Hood. Although he continually claimed to be uninterested in personal power, he became the central figure of the new order. One reason he achieved this position is that several revolutionary rivals of equal stature were killed during the insurrection. But there was a dark side to the new regime. It set up military tribunals for summary trials of Batista's supporters and other opponents. Hundreds died, even though the death penalty was prohibited by the Cuban Constitution that Castro had promised to reinstate, but never did. Many of the firing squads were conducted at La Cabaña Fortress in Havana under the command of Che Guevara. Diana Sawaya Crane remembers the sound of the firing squads echoing through the streets of Havana. She says, I remember my sister and I being on the balcony of the apartment and hearing shots. As kids, we didn't know what was going on. My mother did, of course. She told us, get back in the house, get off the balcony. In mid-1959, the regime took a radical turn, excuse me, and began to make sweeping changes. It began to redistribute land from large landowners to the peasants who farmed it. Much of that land was owned by foreigners. 4 American sugar companies owned 1.6 million acres that was expropriated. The regime also confiscated large cattle ranches, like those owned by the King Ranch in Texas and Likes Brothers of Tampa. The regime promised to pay for the land, but it never did. Then the regime expropriated foreign businesses like American and Canadian banks and mining companies. And it nationalized Cuban companies, including marquee brands like Bacardi. It did so even though the owners of many of those companies, like the Bacardi family, had given Castro large sums of money to support his insurrection against Batista. The sugar baron Julio Lobo said later, "We didn't care who overthrew Castro as long as somebody did." So upper and middle class Cubans began to leave. Many had gone to school in the US or worked for US companies. Cuba historically had seen small numbers of dissidents enter exile, usually in Florida. They would wait until there was a shift in power and then go home. But it was nothing like the masses that left now. To leave, you had to get the regime's permission in the form of an exit permit. To get that exit permit, you had to provide an inventory of all your property and belongings. If you didn't return within a month, everything was taken. Most Cubans took only a few changes of clothes and a little pocket money. They left everything behind, although at first they thought they would only be gone for a few months or a year at most, because they expected the US to overthrow Castro. Al Cardenas of Coral Gables says, "I remember the week preceding it. There was a lot of running back and forth, packing, people saying goodbye, and the sadness of it all. That I remember vividly." Adolfo Enriquez of Key Biscayne says, "In my parents' mind, this was not going to last long." Because the government controlled employment, many of those who applied for an exit permit lost their jobs. Mike Collazo remembers his father being fired from his job as a clerk in a hardware store after he put in papers for his family to leave. He had to support the family with jobs that paid under the table from 1960 until they got out in 1967. To get into the US, a Cuban needed a visa from the US Embassy. Luis Cruz Azaceta remembers standing in line at the embassy to get a visa. His relatives took turns holding his place in line for 3 days. Those waiting for US visas were harassed by Cuban officials, and Luis remembers being heckled by the regime's supporters. Those lines lasted until the US cut diplomatic relations with Cuba in January 1961. When they got to the Havana airport, they entered a glass-enclosed security area called La Peseta, or the fishbowl. Those leaving Havana were inside the fishbowl, and their family and friends were outside looking in. Their suitcases were searched, and many had items confiscated, like watches, jewelry, and other valuables. They were physically searched. Maria Laurencio remembers that she, her mother, and her grandmother were subjected to body cavity searches. Passage through the fishbowl was widely regarded as the most degrading part of leaving Cuba. As the refugee crisis deepened, ship and air travel to the US gradually ended, except for airplanes between Miami and Havana. Commercial airliners going to Havana were empty, but those coming back were packed. At one point, you had to wait months to get a ticket for an airline flight to Miami. At its peak, the first wave brought 1,800 Cubans to Miami each week. After the US cut diplomatic relations in January 1961, no visas could be issued on the island. So the State Department began issuing visa waivers that allowed Cubans into the US anyway. Those waivers were issued only after a security check, however. and they were distributed on the island through intermediaries like airlines, the Catholic Church, and Western embassies. Arriving Cubans had their passports stamped indefinite voluntary departure because everyone expected Castro to fall and the exiles to go home. Most exiles arrived almost destitute, so their initial experience in the U.S. was one of struggle. Professionals like doctors and lawyers couldn't practice because they didn't have licenses. They took any jobs they could get as waiters and dishwashers and cab drivers. Children got paper routes to help support the family. And there was a national commitment to help Cubans get jobs to support their families. Pedro Ferreira remembers how his extended family ended up in a large house on Biscayne Boulevard that had once been a boarding house. 21 people lived there. Now in Havana, they had lived in a family compound on an entire block with 4 homes. They had servants, cooks, and chauffeurs. They owned a vacation home at the beach. They had a yacht. In Miami, they didn't have enough silverware for the family, so they ate in 2 shifts. After your shift, you wash the dishes and silverware for the next shift. Al Cardenas remembers a constant stream of relatives and friends coming from Cuba. For months, they would stay with Al's family until they could get their own place. So Al slept on the living room couch until he went to college. This kind of doubling up was very common among exile families. When President Kennedy took office in January 1961, Cuba was a front burner issue. Kennedy created the most generous refugee assistance program in American history. His motivation was simple. This was the Cold War. He wanted to show that liberal democracy and a free market economy are superior to totalitarian communism. Cubans had to register for the program, and 70% did. They registered in a 17-story building on Miami's waterfront that is now a national landmark known as Freedom Tower. What kind of services did the Cuban refugee program provide? Well, for those who met needs standards, it provided subsistence income with monthly checks. It offered free medical and dental care. It paid for refresher courses so Cuban professionals could take licensing exams. It developed the nation's first bilingual education program in Miami's public schools. It reimbursed foster families and group homes that cared for refugee children who had come without their parents. It distributed surplus food. It sponsored English language courses. To this day, Cubans who came during that period remember the help they got from the government. Terry Garcia remembers going to Freedom Tower periodically to pick up surplus food packages. She and others particularly remember the cans of Spam and the packages of Velveeta cheese in those packages that were a main part of their diet in those early years. The refugee program resettled families elsewhere in the U.S. with a local community organization to help them get settled and an employer to provide a job. Sometimes the refugees found jobs on their own based on their work history in Cuba. Anna Hodges remembers how her father got a job at the Texas State Mental Hospital near Dallas. He was a neuropsychiatrist and had run a psychiatric hospital in Havana. In Texas, he got a job as a clinician, but later got his medical license validated and became the hospital's director. When he did, he began hiring more than 30 Cuban doctors for the Texas State Mental Hospital. Cubans were desperate for jobs to support their families. Many of them competed for unskilled jobs and often got them, creating resentment. That was particularly true in the African-American community. Mario Cartaya tells how his father had been an accountant in Havana, working for Frigidaire and Sylvania. He had a store to sell their appliances. But when the family got here, Mario's father took a job with a commercial laundry. He washed bed linens and towels during the day, and at night, he drove a delivery truck to hotels in Miami Beach. Angel Castillo's father had been a corporate lawyer in Havana, but he couldn't practice law in Florida because he didn't have a license. Angel remembers his father selling smoked fish to bars, going door to door, and packing coins in those little tubes that you get at banks. His mother worked in a commercial laundry, and Angel had paper routes for Miami's morning and afternoon newspapers and gave the earnings to his mother to help support the family. Miami was a tourist destination that had seen better days. The massive influx of Cuban refugees had a major impact on the city. Daily newspapers began printing articles in Spanish. Spanish was spoken in grocery stores. Elevators had recorded messages in Spanish. Many locals resented these changes. Cubans of color had great difficulty in the United States. Only a few came because they knew about the Jim Crow laws, including racial segregation here in Florida. Modern studies show that Miami then was the most segregated city in the United States. The few Cubans of color who came felt out of place in Miami. They typically ended up in northern cities. Even exiles who appeared to be white felt discrimination. Mary Jean Millar remembers the animosity of her Anglo teachers at Miami High School. Others tell stories of being denigrated by an ethnic slur that I'm not going to repeat. Eduardo Padron remembers going to see apartments with a for rent sign, and when the landlord saw they were Cubans, being told the apartments had been rented. Now, this was one of the most striking discoveries from my interviews: the number of Cuban exiles who were befriended by Jews. Isis Hoffman received her architecture degree in Havana before she left Cuba in 1961. She remembers going to New York and looking for work in her field. Finally, an established architect got her a job with a firm that specialized in designing hospitals. When she asked why he had helped her, he said, "Because I'm Jewish, and I know what it means to go from place to place looking for work." Isis turned that job into a career as one of New York's leading hospital architects. Carlos Alvarez came over with his family in 1960 and settled in North Miami. His father had been a lawyer in Havana, but couldn't practice here. When the family's savings began to run out, Carlos's mother, Carlos's mother and father decided to set up a small dress shop because Carlos's mother had learned sewing skills when she was in school. They got space in a small shopping center because the landlords gave them a break on the rent. As Carlos says now, somebody had to take a chance, and it was two Jewish guys. A lot of the Cubans in Miami at that time, 1960 is not that far from the 1940s. When they saw us coming, they sensed something that they could relate to. The first wave ended in 1962, but in 1965, Castro decided to let more dissident Cubans leave. President Johnson offered to charter airliners to create an orderly airlift to the United States. Castro agreed. That was the beginning of the freedom flights from Cuba to Miami. Seats were reserved for relatives of those already in exile. The goal was family reunification. Initial estimates were that 50,000 to 100,000 Cubans would come to the U.S. on the freedom flights, but no one knew what to expect because the freedom flights were unprecedented. A government-sponsored, open-ended evacuation of refugees from a foreign country. It had never been done before. Those leaving had to apply for a seat on the freedom flights. They were not given a Cuban passport. Right before they got on the plane, they got a special exit permit. And those who applied to leave were punished. It was more than losing their job. Heads of households were sent to work in work camps in the countryside to cut sugarcane and pick cotton. Nestor Rodriguez remembers that his father was sent to an agricultural work camp. Every 45 days, he got to come home for a day or two. He was also sent to clean the sewers. So today, Nestor says this: look at the symbolism. You want to leave and have a better life? Well, we're going to show what the revolution thinks of you. As before, Those wanting to leave Cuba forfeited their property and belongings. They turned in an inventory when they applied to leave. Before they were allowed to get on an airplane, soldiers made sure that everything on the list had been left behind. Maribel Henley remembers when the soldiers sealed her parents' apartment with red tape. They were left on the street with only a few clothes. The freedom flights flew twice a day, 5 days a week, with few interruptions. The Castro regime ran a lottery to decide when those on the master list got to go. Each family on the list had a unique number, and the results were announced on Havana radio each week. Dick Walker of Tallahassee was the co-pilot on freedom flights while he worked for National Airlines. The plane flew from Miami to Cuba every morning with U.S. health and immigration inspectors on board. The plane took the first group of Cubans to Miami while the inspectors checked in the second group. When the plane returned, the second group got on board and the plane left again. So did the U.S. inspectors. When the Cubans got off the plane at Miami International Airport, Dick remembers watching many of them kiss the tarmac. Early estimates of the demand to leave Cuba were too low. Castro halted registration for the freedom flights after about 300,000 Cubans had turned in papers. But the freedom flights lasted more than 7 years, until April 1973, and they brought 261,000 more Cuban refugees to the U.S. Here are some of the families that came on the freedom flights. When those on the freedom flights arrived in Miami, there was a joyful reunion. Miriam Marquez remembers going to welcome parties in people's homes and apartments. They were modest affairs because no one had much money. They'd have Cuban foods and Cuban music playing on a record player, and the newcomers would talk about how bad conditions were on the island. This new group of Cuban refugees was not welcomed by everyone. In Miami, politicians and others insisted that the new refugees be sent elsewhere. President Johnson promised that 80% would be resettled within days, and most were resettled where their relatives lived. Plus, Johnson showered federal funds on Miami to help the city absorb all the new refugees. To this day, many Cuban Americans remember the exact date they arrived, and some call it my second birthday. In Washington, decision makers continued to favor the Cuban exiles. The national commitment to help the refugees survive a short-term emergency became a national commitment to help them integrate into American life. In 1966, Congress granted Cuban exiles a green card, no matter what their immigration status had been when they arrived. For those who had been here for years already, Congress cut the waiting time to apply for citizenship in half, from 5 years to 2.5 years. And Congress's goal was quite simple: to help Cubans integrate into America and to give them the ability to support their own families. The Cuban refugee program gave Cubans many kinds of educational assistance. At 15 colleges, the government paid for special courses to train Cuban professionals to become Spanish teachers. Celia Alderman remembers how her father couldn't practice law in the U.S., even though he had been a justice on Cuba's Supreme Court. So he retrained as a Spanish teacher and taught at a small college in Nebraska. The government gave college loans to Cuban young people who met needs standards. Repayment began after graduation, but the government forgave half of the debt for those who took public service jobs, like teaching. It was modeled on the government's college loan program for citizens. Jose Valiente went to the University of South Florida on a Cuban loan and became a prominent accountant there. He says the Cuban loan paid for almost his entire college education. The maximum loan for an undergraduate student was $1,000 a year. Now, that doesn't sound like much by today's standards, but in the 1960s and 1970s, that was enough to pay tuition, books, and living expenses at many public universities. Many leaders in the Cuban American community today got their higher education with a Cuban loan. Cubans set up small businesses in Miami. Many were helped by the fact that they came from an educated middle and upper class, and many had help from the government. One study showed that Cubans got almost half the loans issued by the Small Business Administration in Miami during this period. As Cuban exiles started businesses like grocery stores, coffee shops, pharmacies, insurance companies, and banks, other Cuban exiles traded with them. Hector Laurencio says now, when I had to go to a pharmacy, I didn't go to an American pharmacy. I went to the little Cuban pharmacy. If I would have a sandwich, I didn't have an American sandwich. I had a Cuban sandwich. If I was going to drink coffee, I would not drink American coffee. I would have a Cuban coffee. That's one of the reasons we were successful. We created our own free enterprise economy. Over the years, exiles prospered in business and the professions. They networked with Cuban exiles who had gone to other countries and began to trade with them. They led the remaking of Miami from an out-of-date resort into a modern center for international trade and finance. Today, 1/3 of all U.S. trade with Latin America goes through Miami. Maria Elena Villamil grew up in Tampa, where her family settled after coming to the U.S. in 1959. After going to college in New Orleans and graduate school on Cuban loans, she moved to Miami and found a very different world. She says now, when I came to Miami, it was culture shock. It was like night and day. Since there were so many Cubans, everything was Cuban oriented. I only became more Cuban when I moved to Miami. Over time, the Cubans became the most rapidly successful immigrants in American history. There were many reasons for it. Some were happenstance, but others were the result of deliberate policy decisions made in Washington. And being in Miami was an advantage because it was a young city in an important location, but one whose economy needed to be reinvented just as they arrived. And of course, the Cubans benefited from their celebrated drive. Today, Cuban Americans are concentrated in major urban areas in 15 states and the District of Columbia. 2/3 of them live in Florida, most in Southeast Florida. But the Cuban diaspora is still unfolding. It never stopped. Since last October, 197,000 Cubans have come to the United States. That's almost at the same rate as the Mariel boat lift of 1980. Rather than flying to Miami, today Cuban migrants fly to Nicaragua and come north. Cubans are one of the top nationality groups arriving at our southwest land border. In some months this year, they were number 2, behind only the Mexicans. 20,000 Cubans came in August, and more are coming because conditions in Cuba are so dire. I was in Havana in April, and I remember on the day we left, we arrived at the airport, and there was a mob of Cubans with suitcases trying to get into the terminal because the terminal had several flights to Nicaragua scheduled to leave that day. So the diaspora that began in 1959 is continuing in our time. I want to close by thanking those who made my work on this project possible, both the book and this presentation. And I've saved time for your questions or comments. So Deb, would you please
thank you
get
so
us
much,
started?
Dave. It was fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you.
I would like to start. First of all, everybody who's on Zoom, you can enter your question in chat. Anybody who's here can raise your hand and I'll come over and ask. I have a question already.
Good.
Oh,
I was born in Cuba in 1957.
can you hear?
I can't hear her clearly.
Come on over. Okay, she's going to talk into the camera.
Okay, great.
Right there. Yeah.
Yes, my name is Myra Moore. I was born in Cuba in 1957, left in 1970 to Spain, Madrid, Spain. There were no direct flights at that time. I was there until 1972, October 31st, Halloween. And I came into the United States to LaGuardia Airport and lived in Union City, New Jersey. You know, that's the second largest population.
Havana on the Hudson.
Oh, yes. I was there for maybe 3 years, but it was too cold for my parents. And went down to Miami, quote unquote, Hialeah, and was there for a little bit. And then I married my husband. He came in 1965 with the Freedom Flights. And I have lived the most in the United States in Wisconsin. So, following my husband, he was in medical school over there, and I married him, we stayed and have our 2 cheeseheads kids, and now I'm a villager. Thank you. Your presentation is wonderful.
Well, thank you for that story. I didn't have time to get into it, but your story is not uncommon.
No, it is not.
By 1972, more than 80,000 Cubans had gone to Spain in an effort to get into the United States. Spain was the only other country besides ours that provided any financial support for Cubans who were trying to leave their country. It was more limited than what our government did, but they did provide.
Catholic Church in Spain was very helpful.
The church was the centerpiece of that effort. The waiting time to get a U.S. visa in Madrid in those years was almost 2 years. So your being there from 1970 to 1972 reflects the experience of many people who came to the U.S. through Spain.
Wow, that's fantastic.
Again,
You are
thank
living
you very
history.
much.
Thanks for sharing that.
Yes, sir. Come on over. Yeah, really. Thank you.
I grew up in South Florida, and I was living in Hialeah when the Cuban refugees started coming over. And I can remember in my elementary school class, the first couple Cuban refugees that we had, and I'm sure they were from the upper income levels, you know, and they were more advanced in mathematics and a few other things in their education, which was kind of a surprise to us. And now I don't know, they might have been privately educated, I don't know. But also too, I do remember a lot of the clashes with the Cubans and the blacks, which was quite common in a lot of workplaces. Even when my brother worked, there were fights because blacks felt like the Cubans were taking their jobs away. You know, it was kind of interesting too. Another thing, like you said, I think a lot of places didn't rent to Cubans because they would bring their relatives, families, or other Cubans in, and there would be a large population of Cubans within a house. And but also too, a lot of Cubans would live in a house, and the one who was there the longest, they would all give the money to them, and they could then go out and buy a house for themselves, and then they'll bring another family in, and they would save the money up, and that's how how a lot of them did get housing and so forth. The later Cubans that came over were different than the more educated Cubans that originally came, but I do remember there was an area in Miami they called Little Havana, which was quite popular for the Cubans to work and live. A lot of Cubans came over when they were resettled elsewhere in the United States. They relocated back to Miami, and so yeah, it was kind of interesting in that you saw different types of foods, and you were exposed to being exposed to a different culture and so forth.
You know, I think that that's a really good point, David, because we don't really think about the influence of the Cuban culture on American culture. I don't know why we don't, and I'm glad you're bringing it to our attention. I don't know why we don't.
It is quite significant. Many of the points you just made, sir, were reflected in the interviews that I did with people. For example, quite a few of the people that I interviewed who came over as children did come out of private schools, typically parochial schools, but not always. And all of them said when they got here and they were tested by American schools for purposes of placing them in a grade, they scored far better than American students on math. And their explanation was, as much a guess as anything, I suspect, that the Cubans simply started teaching mathematics to children in their schools earlier than we Americans did at that time. There also were a number of them who talked about the kinds of conflicts that they had, not only with African Americans, but with Anglos, school-age children. And finally, I think you're bringing up an important point when you talk about the tendency that many Cuban families had to cluster together with their extended family. I mean, that was a very old world custom that was very prevalent in Cuba in those years, and they brought it with them, so that when they got a house that was maybe 3 bedrooms, they would get a couple of different families in it, and they would share their money in order to help everybody survive. So all of those are just excellent points.
Thank you.
So there was one other point I was going to make, and I was waiting until you were finished. I can't remember what my statement was, but the whole, I mean, you know, I can remember, we had Spanish when I was in elementary school. We used to start in elementary school. We used to have 15 minutes of Spanish every day. And our family moved away from Hialeah. And one day, several years later, I had to go back to Hialeah. I had to see my mother. She worked in a bank in Miami Springs. And I stopped along Lejeune Road, which was just a few blocks away, which was in Hialeah. I put down there. I didn't recognize. I was in shock and awe, because it was like I was in another country. And I still remember going into getting a chicken dinner, and it was sign was in English. If I walked in there, no one spoke English, and but I knew a little bit of Spanish, so I picked up my chicken dinner. But I was in shock. I mean, I just couldn't. It was like it was in a foreign country. It was amazing the change in a short period of time. Another thing too, the Cubans were very diligent and patronizing, like you said, their own businesses. Mm-hmm. And that's how a lot of them business. I can remember little stores, like a little hardware store. It didn't have half the merchandise of a regular hardware store, but the Cubans would go there and patronize them, and they became a success. And I saw some of the other hardware stores actually go out of business and so forth. So there was.
That's pretty cool.
It's hard to understand everything went on, but if you lived there, and visualized everything went on and saw everything went on, it was quite a change.
It's awesome. Thank you.
Okay.
David, can you tell us about your book again? Can you
Sure.
Let us know how to get it and more about it?
Sure. Well, that'll tell you how you can find out more about it right there on my website. It'll also tell you how to buy it. But the book is an oral history. I'd say probably 80% of the text is composed of excerpts from those 54 interviews that I conducted. And I did that from, I started in 2016 and did that really up until 2020. Interviewing people first in Florida, but then outside Florida, New Orleans, Washington, Texas. And I have organized it so it chronologically follows the evolution of the beginning of this Cuban diaspora, the first wave from 1959 to 1962, and the second wave from 1965 to 1973. Interspersed between the excerpts of from the interviews is a third-person narrative that provides historical background on what was happening at a time that one of the narrators is talking about in his or her personal testimony. So it's intended to provide a perspective and an understanding of what happened in those years, primarily through the experiences of the people who lived it.
Excellent, thank you.
May I
Yes,
just make a comment?
come on back up so we can hear you.
David, as I mentioned before, I lived almost 3 decades in Eau Claire, Wisconsin. Some of it was also Milwaukee. I did a lot of volunteer work with Hispanics coming into our community, especially with parents with school age, no Cubans. I only knew 2 other Cubans when I got to Eau Claire, Wisconsin. And they were lawyers in Cuba. One of them went to school with Castro, and he was teaching at the university, UW Eau Claire. But I started being asked to help with translations and paperwork in Arcadia, Wisconsin. Any of you that know Ashley Furniture? The big manufacturing company is in Arcadia, Wisconsin, and I was overwhelmed how many recent arrival Cubans are there. And I keep asking them, why here? They said, because they're very good employers, they're a local family and amazing benefits, paid vacation, insurance, blah, 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 better pay than Miami. And they say that they are there to save money so they could return to Florida.
Wow, that's so interesting.
Oh, yeah.
Can I have a quick comment?
Yes, sir, come on up so we can hear you online. Yes. Anybody else who wants to speak or ask questions can come up and sit in
I have
those chairs.
Little different, my name's Don Burgess, and I have a little different comment. I was born in 1936 on a sugar plantation in Rebirth province. My parents lived in Cuba for 33 years. My father built railroads for the sugar company that he was employed by. And of course, they were thrown out when Fidel took over and left the country, each with suitcases. But that's only part of the story. I ended up going into banking and spent my entire career in Latin America, traveling back and forth. And I finally settled into Miami, spent 17 years in banking in Miami. I'm working with a Colombian bank and later with a Brazilian bank. And these people that came over initially became the absolute leaders of the city of Miami. And today, Miami is probably the most important international city in the world. I mean, everyone from Latin America comes through Miami. It used to be New York at one time. And also you see a substantial amount of people from Spain investing in Cuba, investing in the United States, and also in Latin America. And all of them come through Miami. And the whole area has been created by these people who came over initially. And I recognize some of the names that you put up. But I just want to comment on Miami today is
Fantastic.
one heck of a great city because of these people.
I absolutely agree. And I'm particularly glad you mentioned the experience of I believe you said your parents living in Cuba before the revolution. I think sometimes we forget how close the United States and Cuba were before 1959. I talked to a number of people that I interviewed who made the point Cuba was almost like an American state without statehood, because the economies of the two countries were so closely intertwined, because so many Americans had gone to Cuba, beginning with the occupation in 1899 to 1902, and had taken on roles in the Cuban economy and made their homes there. So expatriate Americans were very common in Cuba in those years. Some of them set up schools that were used to educate both Cuban and expatriate American children. And I interviewed a number of those people. The other thing that I would mention is my absolute agreement with you on the importance of the Cuban community in the revival of Miami. I moved to Florida in 1975. I moved to Miami. And Miami in those years was nothing like it is now. It was really down on its luck. Its tourism industry had definitely seen better days. Miami Beach was an area of extended poverty. And the city was having a terrible time finding ways to digest this massive influx of Cubans and help them find productive roles in the economy and in society. And, you know, in the ensuing decades, they did. They made an extraordinary difference, not just to Miami, but to all of Florida. So that's why I said at the outset, it's a great story.
Wow. Thank you. Yes.
Hi.
Hi.
My son lives in the Keys now, and he tells me stories about immigrants coming from Cuba, you know, up in boats still. And he's witnessed one not long ago. He was at the beach, and a boat pulled up, and he said within about 5 minutes, people were off the boat. There were 3 SUVs there waiting for them. They were in those, and they were gone.
Wow.
I was wondering if you could tell me, I know this has to be desperation, what the people are going through, or do you know, in Cuba first to be able to do this and then to come over here and what they're facing?
Sure. Great question. Cuba is currently suffering through the most dire economic conditions it's experienced since the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1994. Their economic dislocation, their economy doesn't work. Their economic model has been a failure for a long, long time. We all know that. That's been compounded by the fact that they had the pandemic, and that set them back. It was further compounded by the way that the Trump administration tried to ratchet back on some of the diplomatic and economic measures that Obama had introduced in 2016 to try to restore normal diplomatic and economic relations between the two countries. Cuba had then a budding private sector. It was centered on tourism, and they were counting on Americans coming down and spending money and providing support for those businesses. And so when President Trump ratcheted back on that, it made a big difference to them. The other thing that is fascinating that I just discovered the other day is that so many people are leaving Cuba today that the country is experiencing absolute population decline, not a decline in the rate of growth, but a decline in the number of people living on the island because the population is aging and so many of the young people are leaving, excuse me.
What do you think is going to happen?
You know, that's impossible to say. I'd be surprised if much changes. You know, there's not much political incentive in this country to change our basic orientation to Cuba, even though Obama tried to do that. So my guess is we'll just kind of struggle along the way we have been for a long, long time. It's not a good situation, but I don't see anyone on the horizon having the wherewithal to really make fundamental changes in our relationship.
Wow. All right, if anybody online has any questions, you can pop on or put it in chat and I'll unmute you. Actually, you can unmute yourselves now at this point if you would like. And nobody else in here. All right, I think this is it. David, thank you. This was fantastic.
Thank
I
you.
am just blown away by your knowledge of the entire history of the Cuban American merge
Well, thank
and what's still happening now. So,
well, thanks very much. I enjoyed it. Let me do one more thing here. thanks for your time and your attention. As we said at the outset, this was funded by Florida Humanities and sponsored in part by the state of Florida, Department of State, Division of Arts and Culture, and the Florida Council on Arts and Culture. Florida Humanities appreciates your feedback. You can follow the link on the screen or complete a survey card with your thoughts about the program. And for the latest information about other Florida Humanities events near you, check their newsletter. Thanks very much, everybody.